Well, shalom, everybody. This is Derek Leman, and we are in, I think it's the fourth class. Yes, the fourth class in our series on Theophanies in the Bible. And we're spending parts 2, 3, 4, and 5, so we'll have at least one more week of this in Genesis chapter 18. It's a very interesting chapter. Some of the Theophanies in the Bible are more mystical or perhaps more interesting in some ways than Genesis 18. But what I'm particularly interested in Genesis 18 is the way God appears as a man who walks and talks with Abraham. And we've been going through the evidence for God being one of the three visitors to Abraham throughout the chapter as we've translated and discussed the text. And tonight we have some interesting Hebrew yet again. We're going to be in Genesis 18, verses 17 through 25. And some of the most interesting stuff comes at the end. Well, actually, this whole section, I think, is interesting Hebrew. So before we begin, let's open with a word of prayer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kireshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us, Israel, by his commandments and has commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of your Torah. And we do occupy ourselves with the story of Abraham and when he walked with you and with two angels. And we look for what you would teach us about your presence, about your appearance, about the way you draw near to humanity and even appear to us as a man. And I pray that we would glean from this a greater understanding of your desire to draw near to humanity and to redeem us from within. Amen. In Yeshua's name, amen. So we're going to begin in Genesis 18:17, and I'll try to read a little more slowly tonight. I think last time I read a little quickly. Va'adonai amar, ha-machaseh ani me-Avraham asher ani oseh. Verse 18. Va'avraham hayo yihyeh legoy gadol, va'atzum v'nivrachu vo kol goyei ha'aretz. Verse 19, Ki yadativ lema'an asher yitzaveh et banav ve'et beito acharav. V'shamru derech Adonai la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. Lema'an havi Adonai al Avraham et asher diber alav. Verse 20, Vayomer Adonai za'akat Sodom V'amorah ki rabah v'chatatam ki chavda ma'od. In 21, erada na ve'ere ha'katza'akata haba'a elai asu kala ve'im lo ed'ah. 22, va'yifnu misham ha'anashim va'yelechu Sodoma Va'avraham odenu omed lifnei Adonai. 23. Vayigash Avraham vayomer ha'af tispei tzadikim rasha. 24. Ulai yesh chamishim tzadikim betoch ha'ir ha'af tispei v'lo tisa lamakom lema'an chamishim hatzadikim asher b'kirba. And finally, verse 25. Chalila lecha me asot chadavar hazeh lahamit tzadik im rasha v'haya ka tzadik karasha chalila lach hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Okay, some interesting stuff tonight, and just seeing if we have any questions before we begin. Okay, here we go. Verse 17. Got a couple of interesting words in here, and one thing to realize in verse 17 is that we have the interrogative he. And this is a passage in which Abraham's going to be discussing some things with God, and there are going to be a number of questions. First, Adonai is asking himself some questions, and later Abraham is going to ask him a few questions. And the way the interrogative hey works is this. You're familiar with the fact that when you have a a noun and you want to make it definite, if you want to say, like, say you have the noun book, and you want to say the book. The word book is sefer. To say the book, you have to say ha sefer. You put a ha in front of it. Well, normally, the way the ha is spelled, it has a patach, which is that vowel that looks like a dash under it, and a dagesh, or a dot, is put in the first letter of the root. But with the interrogative hey, the vowel that's under it is usually the patach with two dots beside it. It's a shorter vowel. So it makes the same sound. It still says ha, but it has the shorter form of the vowel, the chataf patach, or the patach with the shava next to it. And we're going to see three interrogative, I believe it is three interrogative heys in our passage tonight. And the first one occurs in verse 17. So before I start translating, just take a look at the third word, hamakaseh. Now, makaseh, as I'm going to explain in a minute, is a participle from the root kasa, which means to conceal. And it has in front of it this hey with a patach under it. But notice that there's no dagesh in the mem. And so that's your clue that this is not a definite article. It's not saying the one who conceals. Instead, makaseh means concealing, or just present tense verb conceal. And the ha is a question. Now, when you have an interrogative hey, or when you have this marker of a question, you have to just sort of translate the phrase and then figure out how to turn it into a question. So I'll kind of explain how that works in a minute. Okay, so let's start at the beginning of verse 17. Va'adonai amah, and Adonai said, Ha-machaseh ani me Avraham. Okay, so what that means, let's leave out the fact that it's a question first. If you just had makaseh ani Avraham, I conceal from Abraham. All right? Now, if the phrase is I conceal from Abraham, how do we turn that into a question? It would be, shall I conceal from Abraham? Shall I conceal from Abraham asher, that which, ani oseh, I am doing. Oseh is the participle form of asa. You can usually recognize a participle because it has an O class vowel over the first root letter. So that's why we have oseh. Shall I conceal from Abraham what I am doing? And let me see if anybody had a question, maybe about, no questions yet. All right, verse 18. Va'avraham hayog yihyeh legoy gadol. All right, what we have here is, all right, hayo. You're probably not used to hayo. In fact, if you're like me, the first time I read it, I thought it said hayu. Hayu would be they were. And we see hayu so many times in the Bible, we get used to it. But this isn't hayu, it's hayo. And we don't see hayo very often. And then notice right after it, we have yihyeh. So these are both forms of the same verb. They're both hey, yod, he, which is the to be verb. And there's a kind of idiom in Hebrew in which you use the same verb in two different forms back to back. The first time it will be the infinitive, and the second time it will be either the imperfect or the perfect. And here we have the imperfect. So let's talk about yihyeh first. Yihyeh means he will be. It's the imperfect form. It has a prefix in front of it, so it's usually future. But right in front of it, we have hayo. Now, hayo is the infinitive absolute. And one of the ways you can recognize an infinitive is there's usually an O class vowel over the second root letter. Now, there is no third root letter here because final hey disappears. But we have an O class vowel after the second root letter. Hey has a comates under it, and then yo has the cholam vav after it, the O class vowel. So that's the infinitive absolute, and it means being. So literally we have, and Abraham being will be. Being will be doesn't make a lot of sense in English. It's an idiom. It means surely will be. It's a way of really emphasizing the meaning of the verb. And Abraham surely will be, legoy gadol, will be what? Will be a great nation. Now, I need to go back and explain the lamed. When you put lamed after haya, it changes the meaning of haya from be to become. So what this really says is, and Abraham surely will become a great nation. Now, how could you know that putting the lamed preposition after haya changes the verb be to the verb become? Well, that's one of the things you can do if you use holiday to its full advantage. Holiday is the Hebrew dictionary that I recommend, H-O-L-L-A-D-A-Y, a concise Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. And if you look up haya, and you look down in the definition of haya, somewhere down in the definition, he will start explaining what if it's followed by certain prepositions. And you have to look. Those are usually transliterated in English letters, not written out in Hebrew. You have to pay attention. And if you look, you'll see that haya followed by la means become. And it's not uncommon in the Hebrew Bible. It happens a fair number of times, so it's a good thing to learn. And Abraham surely will become a great nation, va'atzum, and mighty. So he'll be a great and mighty nation. Atzum isn't a word I was familiar with. I had to look it up. But it means mighty. And then v'nivrachu vo. All right, let's talk about nivrachu. Nivrachu looks like a difficult verb, but let's be verb detectives for a minute and figure it out. What's the root of nivrachu? Well, the ni is clearly a prefix, and the u is a suffix. So we're left with beit, resh, kaf. And beit, resh, kaf, that's a pretty common verb root. You may recognize it. It means to bless. We see it a lot in prayers like Baruch atah Adonai. That's the passive form of it, Baruch. So it has something to do with blessing. And it either could be the imperfect we will bless, but that's not what it's going to turn out to be. Or perhaps this could be the nifal form. So two things will cause a noon to be a prefix in front of a verb. One is if it's the we will form. The other is if it's a nifal. Now, nifal is a form of the verb that can either be passive or reflexive. What do I mean by that? If the root idea of barak is bless, then the nifal form of barak is either going to mean will bless themselves or they will be blessed. So which one does it mean? Now, before we decide that, just remember, you don't have to figure out, just because if you know that nifal is passive or reflexive, and you consider to yourself, okay, that probably means either they will bless themselves or they will be blessed. But you don't have to let your decision rest on what you think. You can look up barak in holiday, and we'll find barak here. Just give me a second. I think it's on page 49. And we'll look down in the nifal. Now, I'm going to disagree with holiday. I'm always recommending holiday, and here I see something that I'm going to actually take a different interpretation of. He only lists one interpretation of it: wish for oneself blessing, like. In other words, he's making it reflexive. So now this is a place where it's good to know the grammar and not be limited to what the dictionary says. So another possibility would be they will be blessed. And having looked into this and all the different references to the Abrahamic covenant, I believe that the meaning is actually passive. In some cases, it's reflexive, but I think in other cases, it's passive. And so I prefer the translation, they will be blessed. But he lists the reflexive as the only possible meaning of nivrachu. So what does it mean? The nivrachu vo, and will be blessed in him, kol goyei haaretz, all the nations of the earth. Let's look at goyei. Goyim would be nations, but when you put it in construct or in word pair form, goyim becomes goyei. Im changes to a. The tsere yod ending always means the somethings of, the nations of the earth. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed, vo, in him. Now, I do want to say that I could be wrong and holiday could be right, and interpreters fall on different sides of this issue. So this could mean, and will bless themselves by him all the nations of the earth. Now, if that's the meaning, then what it's saying is Abraham is going to be so blessed by God that nations going forward are going to say, may I be as blessed as Abraham's descendants are. And that is one possible meaning of the verse. However, God talks about actually blessing those who bless Abraham, and there are enough indications that this blessing is something that God actually does. It's not just people uttering a blessing for themselves. All right, verse 19. Ki yadativ, yadativ, lema'an asher yitzaveh et banav ve'et beito. So, ki yadati. Okay, so yada is the root that means no. And yadati is the perfect. Perfect is usually past, and the perfect is usually the suffix form of the verb. You have the root, and there's a suffix after, and that's what we have here. Yadati. Now leave off the vav for a minute. If you cover the vav with your thumb, you would just have yadati. That would mean I knew or I have known. So ki, for, or because, yadati, I know or I have known, and then that vav suffix means him. For I have known him, lema'an, in order, asher, that, I have known him in order that, yitzaveh. Yitzaveh is an imperfect. It has a prefix. So imperfect verbs usually have a prefix, and sometimes they also have a suffix. But the thing that really makes them different from the perfect is the prefix. And the prefix here is the yod. And then you have the root tzadeh vav he. And tzadeh vav he means to command. You may recognize this root in its common noun form, mitzvah. A mitzvah is a commandment. And that's a noun form from this root. And you also might recognize the feminine plural of it, tzivaot. Tzivaot means armies. It's related to this. So yitzaveh, that he will command. Remember, it's I have known him in order that he will command et banav. Et is the direct object marker. We don't try to translate that. Banav. Now cover up the vav, and you would have banai. Banai is the construct form of banim. Banim would be sons, plural. Then when you put the vav on the end, it means his sons. That he would command his sons. Ve'et, that's and, et, the direct object marker, which you don't translate. Beito, that means his house or his household. That he would command his sons and his house, acharav, after him. Okay, what does it mean by after him? It means the generations who will live after the time of Abraham. God has actually known Abraham in order that Abraham would command his sons and his house after him something. What's he going to command his house? Well, we'll see that in the next phrase. But let's go back to yadativ for a minute. It means I have known, but there's a specific connotation to it here. In what sense has God known Abraham? He has known him in the sense of choosing him or establishing a relationship with him. So some translations will say, for I have chosen Abraham in order that he will command his sons. Or you could say, for I have established a relationship with Abraham in order that he will command his sons. Probably that's what it's hinting at. And people with differing translation philosophies will have to decide, would they rather say it more in a way that's closer to the actual words, or one that conveys the meaning perhaps more accurately and does a little bit of interpreting? So, oh, I see. The chat appears to have a little difficulty tonight. Some people can't see everything in the chat. And I do have a few questions which I'll address in just a minute. So, depending on your translation philosophy, you might say, for I have chosen him in order that, or I have established a relationship with him in order that, or I have known him in order that he might command his sons and his house after him. That Abraham would command his descendants, the ones who are going to live after his time. God is thinking about the future of the people of Abraham in these actions he's about to take against Sodom and Gomorrah. And then he continues. He's going to explain what Abraham is going to command. V'shamru derech Adonai La'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. Okay. V'shamru means, and they will keep. Okay. Shamar means keep, guard, or observe. It's a word that's often used of keeping the Sabbath or keeping commandments. That they will keep derech Adonai. So derech means a road or a way, and it's actually a road. But in a figurative sense, road can mean a certain way of living. And so this is that they will keep the way of Adonai. You could say the road of Adonai, but we're more familiar with this idiomatic sense of road, using the word way for it. That they will keep the way of Adonai. Now, what way of Adonai is he talking about? Because Abraham has not been given any actual commandments. I mean, he was told that if your sons and grandsons want to participate in the covenant, they have to circumcise themselves. But this seems to be talking about more than just one commandment. It seems to be talking about a way of living. Well, there are different philosophies about this. Some Jews believe that God did give Abraham all the laws of the Torah, that it's just not explained to us in Genesis that this happened, so that Abraham, theoretically knew the Torah before Moses knew it. I don't agree with that. I don't think there's any reason to think that. It's going to go on to use the words tzedakah and mishpat, righteousness and justice. People in the ancient world had ideas about righteousness and justice. And the way I see it, God has implanted in all human beings a sense of what's right and what's just. Now, our understanding of that is not perfect. But before you criticize this idea of people knowing something basically about righteousness and justice, even apart from a Bible, even when we have the Bible, people can disagree about the exact right way to do what is right and what is just. Having a Torah gives you a lot more information, but we can still mess it up. As human beings, we can mess up God's revelation, whether it's what he implanted in our hearts, tzedakah and mishpat, justice and righteousness that all human beings know something about, or even if it's a much more specific Torah that he gives us, we can mess it up. But I think that the reference here is Abraham understands if he's going to be a follower of this God, he's going to need to live a just and upright life. And God hasn't told him exactly what justice and uprightness are. But Abraham, like all human beings, has a basic understanding of it. And Abraham is going to apply his basic understanding of rightness and justice to this discussion he's about to have with God about whether God will destroy Sodom. All right, but not only does it say, and they will keep the way of Adonai, righteousness and justice, but then it says, Lema'an havi Adonai al Avraham et asher diber alav. What does that mean? Lema'an, in order that, havi, in order that Adonai will bring, havi Adonai, that Adonai will bring what? Adonai will bring upon Abraham all that was spoken concerning him. So what has been spoken concerning Abraham? God has said that he would make his descendants as numerous as the stars. God has said that he would bless Abraham, that he would cause him to be a blessing to everyone else. And so Abraham's going to command the generations after him to live according to righteousness and justice so that all the things that God has commanded will come upon him. I don't think that this is saying that if the children of Abraham don't do justice and righteousness, God is going to remove the blessing. I think what it means is God knew that in choosing Abraham, he was choosing a man who had a better understanding of righteousness and justice than most people, and that his descendants would, in a very general way, not at all saying that Jewish people are more righteous than non-Jewish people, but in a very general way, the Jewish people would have a legacy among the peoples of the earth of being about righteousness and justice. And so I don't mean this in any way to take away from the righteous deeds of any other people group, but the Jewish people have been known as being concerned about righteousness and justice in general. And again, I'm saying that just in a general way. And so that probably is the reason why God chose Abraham to begin with. He loved him for it. Okay, so there's a question. Are you saying that the dagesh and the mem would have identified a personal noun? Oh, you're going back to the interrogative hey, but we're not to that yet. I'll clarify. Oh no, we did cover that. Hamachaseh. Okay, yes. If there was a dagesh in the mem in verse 17 where it says hamachaseh, then machaseh, that would have been a participle being used as a noun. It would have meant the one who conceals, if there was a dagesh in the mem. But since there's not a dagesh in the mem, you know that that hey is not the definite article. It doesn't mean the. It means turn this into a question. All right, let's see. I think we have another question. Verse 17, no shiva, still interrogative because mem has no dagesh. Yes, that is correct. Even though the vowel under the interrogative hey is not the patach with the shiva next to it, the fact that there's no dagesh in the first letter is your clue that that's the interrogative hey. And then we have another suggestion. They will seek blessing through him, would also work as a translation of the nivrachu vo. And, oh, we have a comment from Rashi. Well, someone writes a comment from Rashi. Rashi obviously isn't joining us in class tonight. Rashi says, I have cherished him because he commands. So Rashi doesn't think that the verb yada means cherish. He's interpreting it. Just like I said, if someone said chosen him or established a relationship with him, that would be interpreting it. And Rashi's doing the same thing, but he's choosing the idea of cherished. I guess there's a certain sense in which you could see Rashi's point, because to know someone in an experiential sense means to have a relationship with them, or in a sense to cherish them. Okay, so now we're on verse 20. Vayomer Adonai, and Adonai said, Za'akat Sodom, the outcry of Sodom, Va'amorah, and Gomorrah. Isn't it surprising that in English we've always called it Gomorrah, but in Hebrew it's Amorah? So maybe one reason why it's been called Gomorrah, there's a theory that in ancient times the letter ayin wasn't silent like aleph, that there was a distinction between aleph and ayin, that ayin would have been pronounced in the throat. And if that's true, instead of saying Amorah, people would have said Amorah, Amorah. So it would have been Sodom v'Amorah, Amorah. It's kind of hard to say. So maybe that's where the English pronunciation Gomorrah came from. People who had that theory and were seeing it as being in between a silent letter and a G, kind of like a G you make deep in your throat. Sodom v'Amorah, ki rabbah, for great. Oh, the outcry against Sodom, that it is great. Yeah, how did I translate that? Let's see. It's literally the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, ki rabbah, that it is great. I guess that's the best I can do at trying to render it literally. And Adonai said, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, it is great. V'chatatam, and their sin. Chatat, sin, there. V'chatatam, and their sin, ki kavda ma'od, that kavda, heavy, ma'od, very heavy, that it is very heavy. Usually the masculine form of this is kavod, but the feminine form of the adjective is kavda. And cities and sin are feminine, so since chatat is feminine, the adjective that goes with chatat has to be feminine. So that's why we see kavda instead of kavod. So, wait a minute. Did I skip something? No, I didn't. The outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, that it is great, and their sin, that it is very heavy. Now it's in verse 21 that Adonai is going to have to go and see this for himself. It seems that he's heard about this outcry from Sodom and Amorah, but he wants to see it himself. And in order to express that he's going to come down himself and see it himself, we get here two cohortative verbs. Now, what's a cohortative? All right, a cohortative is a first-person imperfect with a hey on the end. And that's what we have here. This very first verb, we see an example of it. We have a rada. Now let's just break down a rada for a minute. Cover up the aleph, that's the prefix. And you have rada. Now cover up the hey, because that's the cohortative hey. I'll explain what the cohortative hey means in a minute. So we only have two root letters left, resh and dalet. So what's missing? When you only have two root letters, I always think the first thing you should guess if you're unsure is that the first letter is missing. There are so many drop letters, and we call this a drop letter imperfect, that you should probably always guess that first. So if you have resh and dalet, and the first letter is missing, the two most common suspects for a drop letter imperfect are yod and nun. In case it's not yod or nun, if it's something else, a way to remember all of the letters that drop out from the first position is vanilla. Vav, nun, yod, lamed, hey, vanilla. But always guess yod or nun first. So we know a very common verb that has yod, resh, dalet, yarad, and it means to descend or to come down. Now, if you didn't know that this was a cohortative, you might have spent some time looking up resh, dalet, hey. And I don't know, I didn't check. I don't think there's a verb resh, dalet, hey, but there might be. But it won't make any sense in the sentence. So hopefully you figure out that this hey is here for another reason. And I want to teach you about cohortatives so that you won't wonder about a strange hey coming on the end of a verb. All right, but let's leave out the hey for a minute. Let's just say it said erad. Erad would mean I will descend. I will come down. But because it's an imperfect, it expresses future. But when you put the hey on the end, it becomes a cohortative. And cohortative means something like, let me come down. Or I must come down. It's expressing some other sense of resolve in the speaker. The speaker is either saying, let me, or I must. And God's probably not asking permission. Probably he's saying, I must. Now notice it has the na on the end. Some people call that the particle of entreaty, but why is it being used on an I must or a let me? God's not asking anyone for permission. There's no one that God has to be polite to. He's thinking to himself in this conversation. So the na is just kind of there to soften it, to kind of give a sense of God is doing this for a good reason, for a benevolent reason. He's coming down to check out the city of Sodom. He's not just going to accept what he's heard. God wants to know with sure knowledge that things are really that bad before he's going to destroy the city. So I must come down, the er-a. And notice the er-a also has a hey on the end. This is also a cohortative. I must come down and I must see. Must see what? And then we have, all right, you're gonna say that I taught you incorrectly about the interrogative hey here. Because this is an interrogative hey. But notice it has a patach under it. And yet there is a dagesh in the first letter of the next word. But let's just break, all right. This one's hard to explain, so let me start all over again. This word has three parts to it, actually four parts. The word itself is sa'aka. So you see you have the tzade, the ayin, the kof, and the tav. Now, if this didn't have a suffix on it, that tav would be a hey. And the word that you look up in the dictionary is sa'aka with a hey. Sa'aka means outcry. But that hey changes to a tav because there's going to be a suffix after it. And that's what heys do before a suffix. It goes to the construct form of the word. Hey changes to tav. So if we just had sa'akata, sa'akata would mean the outcry of it or the outcry of her. And there's a dot in the hey. because when a suffix means her, there's usually a dot in it. To clarify, it's not an ah for some other reason. It's the ah that means her. In this case, the her is a city. Cities are feminine. So tsakata by itself would mean the outcry of her. Okay, but what about the ha and the ka? Well, let's start with the ka. Ka usually means like or as. But this ka goes with the ra, I must see. And when you put ka after ra'ah, the meaning is I must see if. Okay, or I must see that. So it's in other words, he needs to see some evidence. And that's when you use ka after ra'ah. All right. So if we didn't have the ha there, let's leave out the ha for a minute. If it was just ve'ere katsakata, I must see if her outcry. Okay? But then we have the interrogative he in front of it. And you probably say to me, well, why does it have the patach instead of the patach with the shva? Because you can't put two shvas in a row like this, where the second one is silent. So just for an obscure spelling rule, they had to put a full patach under it. All right? But it's a question. So now we're going to have to translate the phrase and then figure out how to turn it into a question. And I must see if the outcry of it, haba'ah, I must go down and see if the outcry that is coming elai unto me. Okay, haba'ah, ba'a is the infinitive form. And haba'ah means the one coming. So if you leave out the ha here and you just had ba'a, the outcry coming. Well, oh, I know what it is. I know what it is. I just explained this very badly. This is an infinitive being used as an adjective. And I forgot that infinitive sometimes can be used as adjectives, not as nouns. So the infinitive ba'a is an adjective modifying ta'akata, her outcry. So the way adjectives work in Hebrew, if the noun being modified is definite, it's the something, or a specific noun, and her outcry is definite, then the adjective that modifies it has to be definite also. So which outcry of her are we talking about? The outcry of her coming to me. And so the word coming is being used as an adjective to describe which outcry. It's the outcry of her that is coming. And so you have to have the definite article in front of it to match sa'akata. The Hebrew tonight it's got a lot of intricacies. I'm not sure we're going to be able to finish this passage. It doesn't look like we're going to be able to. Ha katsa'akata haba'a. The outcry that is coming, elai, unto me. Asu kala. It is kala. Kala means complete. It is complete. So how do we translate this? I must go down and I must see if the outcry that is coming to me does completely, or they have done completely. Let's say asu means they have done. It's the they form in its perfect past tense. They have done completely. What does it mean, the outcry they have done completely? Something causes an outcry, a cry of injustice in the city. And what God wants to know is whether the people of Sodom have done completely the thing that caused this outcry. In other words, is it their fault? So this is some pretty obscure stuff to translate. The way I translated it is, I must go down and see if the outcry that is coming to me, if they have done enough to merit the outcry. I was trying to think of a way to translate it that gives you the complete sense of it. What God wants to know is, did the city do something to cause this outcry to go up? So the question word, the interrogative hey is there to turn it into a question. So how would we turn it into a question? I must go down and I must see, is the outcry that is coming to me that something that they have done completely, something that they have completely done themselves? Did the people cause this outcry? And then he says, Ve'im lo eda'a. And if not, I must know. Notice there again, we have the cohortative hey on the end of this verb. Edah, without the hey there, would mean I will know, but edah with the cohortative hey on the end changes it to I must know. And if not, I must know. Have the people of Sodom done this thing to cause this great outcry? If not, I must know. Okay, verse 22. And here we get back to the story. All of this has been Adonai talking to himself. But now in verse 22, we come back to the story. And the Hebrew is a lot easier in this verse, thank goodness. Vayifnu misham. All right, yifnu is an imperfect. The root is pe, nun, hey. And when you have a verb with a third hey, the hey usually drops out. And the u suffix is the they form. So pana means to turn. So vayifnu, and they turned me from sham there. Ha-anashim, the men. All right, so what happened? Abraham has been with 3 visitors, but now the men depart. Well, it doesn't say how many of the men depart right here, right? If he was with 3 visitors, how many men depart? Well, we know it has to be at least 2. What's going to happen in the story as it unfolds is Abraham is still going to be standing with one of them. So we know that it's not all 3 who left. Only 2 out of the 3 leave. And where do they go? We won't see the answer to that until verse 1 of chapter 19. In verse 1 of chapter 19, we're going to see Vayava'u Shnei HaMalachim, and there arrived the 2 angels. So here they're called men, but in 19:1, they're going to be called angels. So if Abraham is with 3 visitors, and some of them leave and go towards Sodom, and then a few verses later we find out it's 2 of them who went to Sodom, and that they were 2 angels. That leaves the 3rd visitor. And the 3rd visitor, Abraham is about to have a conversation with. And we're going to see that in this verse. This verse is setting that action up. So let's finish translating it. Vayifnu misham hanashim, and the men turned from there. Vayelechu, and they went Sodoma. So Sodom means Sodom, the city of Sodom. And this when you put an on a place, the ending means so many different things. On a noun, it means feminine. On a first-person imperfect verb, we just saw it turns it into a cohortative, which means the must form or the let form. But what happens if you put on the end of a place? That's called the directional hey or the locative hey. This means, and they went toward Sodom. So they haven't arrived at Sodom. They're going in the direction of Sodom. They're going to be going that way for a little while. And they went towards Sodom. Va'avraham odenu omed lifnei Adonai. All right, what's this? But Abraham, now why did I translate the va as but? A lot of people think va means and. It doesn't mean and, it's just a general conjunction. It means whatever it needs to mean to set up the next clause. I think in a little while ago I translated va as a that. Sometimes you might decide not even to translate the vav. But here it's going to contrast 2 things. The men walk away towards Sodom, but Abraham is not going to walk away. Okay, instead, Odenu Omed Lifnei Adonai. We'll come back to the Odenu in a minute. Let's just look at Omed Lifnei Adonai. Omed is the participle of Amad. Amad means to stand. Ayin Mem Dalet. And you can tell it's a participle because we have an O class vowel over the first root letter. And an O class vowel over the first root letter is a participle. And it means standing. So standing, lifnei, before Adonai, standing before Adonai. And Abraham, something standing before Adonai. Now let's look at Odenu. Od means still. And then the nu is an ending that means him. I realize in many cases nu means us. And you can only tell by context sometimes when nu means him instead of it meaning us. So they don't, in other words, in Hebrew, if you wanted to say still him or still he, you wouldn't say odo. You wouldn't just put the o or right after ode. And this happens on some words. Instead, you have a transitional consonant, noon. And the noon doesn't really mean anything. It's the fact that the vav comes after it. The vav means him or he. So in Abraham, still he was omed, standing, lifnei Adonai, before the Lord. And the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham, still he was standing before the Lord. So we have three visitors, and some of them walk away. But Abraham, he's still standing before the Lord. Well, how is it that he's standing before the Lord? Because one of the three visitors is the Lord. One of them walks with Abraham, and they have a discussion, which is what's going to ensue in the next couple of verses. And I would go on ahead tonight and cover verse 23, 24, and 25, but they're actually fairly complicated. And it would take me a long time to explain them. But basically so I will cover them next week in part 4. And I may end up summarizing the last few verses in part 4 instead of translating every word just to get us through this passage. But what's happened is we've had a chapter that's been a bit of a mystery. And I've been in every part explaining my interpretation of the mystery, and a lot of other commentators have the same interpretation that I do. The chapter begins with the note that Abraham saw the Lord by the oaks of Mamre. But then it doesn't say any more about him seeing the Lord. Instead, a new story starts, a story about 3 visitors coming to Abraham, and he runs to them and invites them for hospitality, and he throws them this big meal, and he insists on standing while they eat, and they get into a discussion. And you don't find out until verse 13 that one of the 3 visitors is Adonai, is the Lord. Because all of a sudden the Lord starts speaking. And apparently one of the 3 visitors is the Lord. Then what happens is they get up and they're walking, and 2 of them walk off towards Sodom, and one continues walking with Abraham. The one that continues walking with Abraham apparently is the one who spoke in the name and the persona of the Lord. And so Abraham seems to know that he is, in fact, Adonai, that he is the Lord. And they have a discussion. And Abraham's going to have this discussion about what will it take for him to spare Sodom. And the reason, of course, that Abraham cares is his cousin Lot is in the city of Sodom. And in verse 25, he's going to call him the judge of all the earth. I think one of the most interesting passages in the Bible expressing who God is, that he is the judge of all the earth. It's one of the key things to know about God and to understand that at the end of history, God is going to judge the whole earth. And Abraham already has this sort of conception of God, that since he's the universal God, he has judgment over all the nations, over everything that happens in the world. Abraham's view of God is very big. I think that's also a part of why God chose him. Abraham seemed to be someone who could just grasp who God was when other people could not. And this is an interesting theophany because God appears to Abraham as a man, talks to Abraham as a man would talk to another man, walks with him and has a discussion with him. And we see that Adonai is sovereign. We see that he is ultimately the one who decides everything that's going to happen. He has all the power, and Abraham can merely negotiate with him as an inferior, talking to a superior. But God humbles himself and lets Abraham have this conversation with him. So we see these 2 things about God in this theophany, that he wants to come down to us and meet us where we are, but that when he does that, he doesn't give up his supremacy. He doesn't give up his superiority. He will condescend to have a conversation with human beings and to treat us with respect, but he's not going to give up his greater knowledge of the situation and his greater understanding of what has to be done to redeem the world. And Abraham seems to understand this, that God is deigning to speak to him and that he must speak to him as a superior and speak to him very respectfully, like a great king, greater than any king on earth. And to me, it's just a beautiful picture. And I can't help but saying, as a Messianic Jew, to me it's a beautiful picture of the way God became a man. He didn't just appear as a man like he does here to Abraham. He became a man, the man Yeshua. And the man Yeshua appears very humble. But when you understand who he really is, and he has now ascended to that place where we understand who he really is, he actually maintains the superiority. And he decides what must be done to redeem humanity. He condescended to come down near us, but he is truly above us. And so he relates to us not exactly as equals, but as if we could be on his level, when in fact he's actually far above us. And that's what happens here. Imagine if God decided to just become a man and walk beside you and have a conversation with you. That's what happened to Abraham. God does that because of his great love and his great respect for his creatures. So next week, what we're going to do, we're going to cover the 3 verses we didn't get to tonight. That would be verse 23, 24, and 25. And we're going to discuss all the way through 19:1. So we're going to finish Genesis 18, and we're going to look at 19:1. I probably won't be able, I won't even try to translate every single verse next week. That's too many verses. So translate as many as you can if you're doing homework, and I will summarize the last few verses for your understanding. It's really important, though, that you look at 23, 24, and 25, because verse 25, to me, is one of the most interesting verses in the entire Hebrew Bible. And many of you probably already translated that for tonight, so you already know what I mean. This is Derek Leman signing out. We'll see you next week. And for those of you who are here on the chat, I'll stay a few minutes and answer some questions.